But what happened next would turn everything upside down. A seasoned black colonel, known for her poise and the respect she'd earned for years of service, suddenly found herself face to face with a cop who wasn't quite ready for the encounter. His prejudices? Oh, they were blatant, impossible to ignore. The way he spoke, his sharp tone, the words dripping with assumptions, it was clear his demeanor screamed one thing: unchecked authority. But here's the thing, this wasn't just some random civilian he was pulling over. No. What the officer didn't realize was that he had stopped someone who had been through far tougher battles than his condescending attitude could ever prepare him for. The colonel, unwavering, handled the situation in a way that left him completely stunned. Every word that left her mouth unraveled the officer's biases, forcing him to face his own actions in a way he never expected. And by the end of it all, she didn't just stand her ground. She completely flipped the script. What did she do that left him speechless? Stick around to find out. The officer loomed over her car window, demanding answers, not just about the reason for the stop, but about her very identity. His eyes narrowed, suspicion clear in his voice as he asked, "Where are you headed?" But the colonel, dressed casually in civilian clothes, didn't flinch. Her composure was a result of years of experience facing situations much more intense than this one. Instead of rushing to answer, she responded calmly, "Is there a reason you pulled me over, officer?" Her voice? It carried the authority of someone who had led troops, navigated high-pressure situations, and dealt with challenges far greater than a traffic stop. But the officer? He wasn't ready to let go of his assumptions just yet. He pressed on, his tone sharp and pointed, but what he failed to see was that the woman before him was no ordinary person. She had a story, a legacy, a presence that would soon make this encounter unforgettable for him. As he scanned her documents, his demeanor shifted just slightly, but that skepticism still lingered in his eyes. He was looking for something, anything, to justify his behavior. "What brings you through this area?" he asked, the question dripping with a thinly veiled challenge. The colonel took a steady breath, carefully selecting her words before responding. "I'm on my way to meet someone." Her tone remained firm, yet respectful. But under the surface, she was calculating, piecing together exactly how to handle this. This wasn't just a routine stop, it was a test of power, prejudice, and how she chose to respond to both. Meanwhile, a small crowd of onlookers started to form, their curious stares adding a new layer of tension. The officer noticed the gathering crowd, but didn't let up. He doubled down, asking questions that only deepened his mistake. What he didn't realize was that with every question he asked, with every action he took, he was setting the stage for a moment that would change everything. The officer stepped back, scanning her car as though looking for something to justify his actions. His questions grew more intrusive, more condescending. "Are you sure this vehicle is registered to you?" he asked, raising an eyebrow as he held her registration. But the colonel? She didn't flinch. "It is," she replied, her voice steady and unshaken. She had nothing to prove here, but she knew the importance of staying calm in moments like this. She wasn't just defending herself. She was setting an example for everyone watching. The tension was thick in the air. The crowd, some recording the exchange on their phones, whispered among themselves. The officer glanced at them, his confidence wavering for just a moment before he turned back to her and said, "I need you to step out of the car." His voice was firm but tinged with uncertainty. Without a moment's hesitation, the colonel met his gaze, steady, unyielding. She opened the door and stepped out, standing tall. Her quiet strength caught the officer completely off guard. She didn't need to raise her voice or argue. Her presence alone spoke volumes. The crowd leaned in, sensing that something big was about to unfold. And in that moment, the officer began to realize that he was no longer in control of this situation. What he thought would be just another routine traffic stop was quickly turning into something much, much bigger. For just a brief second, the officer faltered, but he quickly masked his hesitation with a sharp command, "Hands where I can see them." His tone was biting, even though the colonel hadn't made any sudden movements. She complied without hesitation, her expression calm, but unwavering. Her gaze was steady, unbroken. The murmur from the crowd began to grow, the tension thickening in the air. And then, out of nowhere, another car pulled up. A senior officer emerged, his uniform crisp and flawless, his demeanor commanding respect. He scanned the scene swiftly, his eyes landing on the colonel. For a split second, there was silence, and then recognition flashed across his face. "Colonel, is everything okay here?" he asked, his voice carrying an unmistakable respect. The younger officer stiffened, his expression shifting from confusion to realization. He suddenly understood that the woman he'd been interrogating wasn't just anyone, but rather someone much more significant. However, instead of backing down, he dug in his heels. "She's acting suspiciously," he blurted out, his voice defensive. The senior officer's expression darkened, just slightly, but his composure remained intact. "Suspicious?" he asked, his voice calm but cutting. "Do you have any evidence to support that, or are we just making assumptions here?" The crowd, sensing the shift in power, fell into a hushed silence. The colonel, however, didn't speak, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. The younger officer was now clearly uncomfortable, but his pride prevented him from backing down. The tension was almost unbearable when, finally, the colonel spoke, her voice clear and commanding, cutting through the stillness like a knife. "Officer," she said, her tone unwavering, "do you know who I am?" The question hung in the air, heavy with authority. The younger officer hesitated, caught off guard, and unsure how to respond. Before he could stammer out an answer, the senior officer stepped forward, his voice firm and controlled. "This is Colonel Johnson, a decorated veteran, someone who has served this country with honor for over 2 decades, he said, each word carrying weight. The crowd reacted instantly. A soft gasp rippled through them as the realization settled in. The younger officer's face went pale, and he quickly realized the magnitude of his mistake. He stumbled over his words, trying to explain himself, but the colonel raised her hand, silencing him immediately. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice firm. "It's about how you treat people. Anyone, regardless of their rank, their uniform, or their background." The senior officer nodded, his expression serious and solemn. "Colonel, I apologize on behalf of this department. This behavior is unacceptable." The younger officer, now clearly shaken, muttered a weak apology, but the colonel wasn't finished yet. She took a step closer to him, her voice steady and resolute as she addressed him directly. "Use this moment to reflect, to do better. Because next time, it might not be someone with a title you recognize." As the senior officer led the younger officer aside for a stern conversation, the colonel turned to face the crowd. She offered a small, knowing nod before calmly getting back into her car. For a moment, the onlookers were silent, the air still thick with the aftermath of what had just unfolded. And then, slowly but surely, the sound of clapping started. It spread through the crowd, a ripple of appreciation for what they had just witnessed. As she drove away, the colonel's phone buzzed. A new message popped up from an unknown number. "Thank you for what you did today. You're changing more than one life." She glanced at the screen, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Even in the midst of conflict, the ripples of her actions were reaching farther than she had ever imagined. As the colonel continued her drive, the tension from the encounter began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment. Moments like this, she knew, weren't about dramatic victories or proving others wrong. They were about planting seeds of change. The younger officer had been humbled, and the senior officer had shown the importance of accountability. As she reflected on the faces in the crowd, one in particular stood out, a young boy standing beside his mother, watching closely. She hoped he had seen more than just the conflict, that he had witnessed the power of staying calm, of standing firm and commanding respect, without raising her voice in anger. By the time she reached her destination, a renewed sense of purpose washed over her. It wasn't about the titles or the recognition, it was about using her voice and her actions to pave the way for those who would follow. And today, she had done exactly that.